Hello everyone, my name is Ben Eady. I'm the online media manager of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar entitled How to Use Sociocracy to Improve Collaboration and Expand the Agile Practices. Today's featured speaker is Derwin Harris from JAMA Software, and the webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the question feature of the webinar software. I'd also like to say thank you to JAMA Software for sponsoring this event. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Derwin to get us started.
Thank you very much. So hello everybody, this is Derwin Harris, and I guess first I just do a quick mic check. If you can't hear me, well I guess if you can hear me, I'm going to assume that my voice is coming across loud and clear and that you can see the title page, which is How to Use Sociocracy to Improve Collaboration and Expand Agile Best Practices. I am actually very excited to be here and to give this presentation. This is the first time we've done this topic, so I'm very excited about it. I'll be also very interested to hear your questions as well as any feedback about the presentation or the webinar today. So definitely I encourage it and love to hear from folks. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. First and foremost, who am I? I'm Derwin Harris. I manage a solutions architect team here at JAMA Software. I'm also one of the co-founders. And I've been in the industry for quite a long time. I've worked with a lot of different companies that have utilized different methodologies dating back to the, I won't say how far back, but it's interesting to think about all the different companies that I've worked with. I sort of did an exercise to kind of start counting how many companies, and I was up in the 50s, and that doesn't include a lot of the demonstrations and just phone calls that I have on a daily basis. So it's interesting to sort of have that kind of visibility into how customers and companies in general are attempting to really adapt to Agile or just utilize requirements, best practices in general. And really the thing that comes out a lot from those conversations is the communication problems that people face. And so that's really the primary basis for today's topic. So that's me. JAMA Software, the company that I work for and with, is located in Portland, Oregon. We were founded in 2007. We currently have 600 plus customers, and that's really exciting because they really span different industries and verticals, different methodologies, hardware, software. So it just gives us such a unique visibility into the different types of problems people are faced with. 12 of them are of the Fortune 100, and so we're really dealing also with different sizes of complexity. Some organizations have incredibly complex architectures or products that they're attempting to build. And again, it's very interesting to work with them to sort of understand where they're successful and also where they struggle. And so again, that's where a lot of these topics that I give stem from. So let's dive into today and the reason we're here. Really, there's quite a few challenges that organizations are faced with. We talk about process and methodologies, but there's really a lack of communication when working with products and communicating what we're building and why. And there tends to even be confusion around that. We might think that we're communicating something, but in reality, what people understand to be reality isn't the case. And so because of this, we end up missing deadlines, we end up missing expectations, and because of this as well, there's a lot of redundant conversations and work that's taking place. We tend to rehash things that have already been discussed as different people get pulled in, as conversations change, or the definition of what we're working on isn't well defined. And this ends up resulting in a lot of unsynchronized work where people are working on different things at different times, and it's just simply not sort of working in parallel, or as I like to say, it's not creating a nice sense of flow. There's this idea that, and I'm sure all of you have felt this, that at times within your organization you've felt that everything is working perfectly, like there's this flow that we're creating a product, everyone's in agreement and in alignment, and that's a beautiful thing when you accomplish that. And so that's part of today's conversation as well, is how do you achieve that, and what is that concept of flow, so that we really feel that everybody's in alignment and that we're not all confused about what's being built, and that the communication is happening much more efficiently. So the way I'm going to describe this is I'm going to build on this concept. I'm going to talk about sociocracy, I'm going to talk about agile, and I'm going to talk about collaboration. And the idea is that these three concepts really work well together to not only enable engineering teams to be more collaborative and effective, but to enable an entire organization to operate more effectively. So that's the primary goal again today. And so we'll start with this idea and this concept of sociocracy. Now, this term, and we'll dive a bit into it, was new to me as well about a year ago, and I found it when I was doing searches for the combination of agile and collaboration, trying to really understand, because we've seen, and I'll talk more about this, how agile has evolved into these different methodologies, but I felt that the idea of collaboration was kind of getting muddled or wasn't utilized as well as it could be. And so I found this term, sociocracy, and I simply just fell in love with it. The concept is really great. And so let's dive in. The first thing is, how do we say this word? It's sort of humorous even here around the office as I've been talking about this webinar and everybody sort of struggles with the pronunciation of it. So I thought as an exercise, what we would do here is I'd like all of you to say this word. It's sociocracy. So I'm going to give you a moment. All right. Hopefully everybody said that and we're all on board. So it's sociocracy. And once you figure out how to say it, it's actually quite easy, but it took me a while as well. So this is what we're talking about today. And what is that? So it's ultimately a system of governance. I know that sounds kind of heavy, and we're not talking socialism, we're not talking government changes, but there is some very interesting concepts that are embedded in this term. So if you look at it and understand it, the things that really were calling out to me was these ideas of consent-based decision making. So, you know, if I was to compare this to socialism, socialism is the distribution of wealth. Someone's deciding that, all right, all things are equal and we're simply distributing it evenly. The difference here is that you're empowering the people to ultimately make the decisions. And so I know this webinar isn't about governments and systems, but it's really applying this concept to organizations. So the two things that came out is this idea of consent-based decision making, and I'll talk more about that. But more importantly, I love this term down below where it says engages the energy and creativity of all members of the organization. This is great because what it's telling me is that in order to really, when you're looking at your organization, you want to utilize this creativity and this energy of the people within your organization, the people within your teams. And to get that is an incredibly powerful thing. I mean, every organization dreams of this idea that the entire organization is sort of all motivated and driven towards a common goal. And they spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to accomplish that. And that's kind of really what this sociocracy is all about, is getting that kind of buy-in and that excitement and that engagement that you want from the members within your organization. And so if we look deeper into the concepts of what makes up sociocracy, it really boils down to three principles. It's interesting, when I was reading up on this, they originally had 4 principles. And you know, if you do the research on how people understand or comprehend or remember things, there's a certain number that we can memorize, which is 7, but when we're dealing with sort of bullet points or concepts, our limit is pretty much around 3. So that's one of the reasons why they came up with 3, and it works out, of course. The first is this idea of consent to policy decision. I really, to be honest, I don't like the way this reads. It just sounds real sort of logistical and lawyer-esque, but the concept of it is actually really important to the success of sociocracy. And the definition is laid out here, which is that policy decisions are designed to help define the scope of operational day-to-day decisions. So this is important because what we're really saying is that we need to come up with some guidelines. And we need to come up with some policies that we as a group are operating under. And these guidelines need to be defined through consent. That is, the group that you're working with, which I'll talk more about, you're all in agreement that yes, these are the guidelines that we operate under. So similar to a democracy where we're also deciding on something, this is about consent. This is really everybody coming together and coming to a conclusion. Now, those policies really need to be amendable. That is, they need to be flexible because you're going to learn. This is just like Agile best practices where it's intended to be adaptive. As you go through and you do your iterations and you do your retrospectives, you want to be able to adjust and amend as you see fit to ensure that you're continuing to be successful. So some quick examples of some existing policies. The Constitution's a perfect example. Our founding fathers got together and through a lengthy debate came to a consensus over what the Constitution or how it should read. And this provides guidelines for what ultimately we all operate under. Some lesser, smaller versions of this would be our New Year's resolutions, which we may not be as we may amend these quite quickly within the year, but it's the same concept, this idea that I've come to an agreement, and maybe this is within your household, and maybe the entire household has come to an agreement, or and then you can expand out from there. So it really is just this this coming to an agreement on how are we going to operate day to day. The next policy is this idea of a circle, and so this feels like a new concept, but when you really think about it, it's not, because when you look at an organization, you already have existing circles in place. You just don't necessarily call it out as such. You could claim that a marketing department is a circle, or that a Scrum team is a circle. And again, I'll talk more about that. But what Sociocracy is really saying is that define these circles, give them the control and define them. Who's in it? What are their roles? What are their guidelines? And then allow them to define their policies that they're going to operate under. So this is the second principle. The third principle is really interesting and probably the most challenging. It's this idea of double linking, right? So you've got this circle, and that circle is working. They're working great. They have flow. Everything's going perfectly fine. But that circle is just one small group within a bigger picture. So how does the information and the work that's being accomplished within that group be communicated to the rest of the organization? And so this is where it's important to start thinking about, well, what are the different circles that exist? Because it's not enough to say, we've got this one circle, and then you have the rest of the org. It's important that we start looking at the entire org as these different groups that are working on objectives and goals, and that they are working within a set of policies that they've agreed to, but that there's this concept of double linking so that we don't create these islands. What we're doing is we're really trying to create a connected sequence of groups and users. So when we put these three together, what we end up with is we end up with a sense of communication that's taking place throughout the organization, because this double linking is providing a way in which communication is happening effectively. And I will talk more about that as well. So if we compare this to hierarchy, and I'm not necessarily saying that hierarchy or corporate structures is bad, what I'm really saying is that you can't rely on this alone, because hierarchy alone really has this sort of flow down concept where decisions are made at a higher level. They are then sort of delegated down to the rest of the team, and they simply have to accept that decision. And that doesn't necessarily create innovation, it doesn't create creativity, and doesn't necessarily empower the users to want to act on those decisions if they perchance don't agree to it, or it's not something that they came up with. And so you want to sort of figure out, it's okay to have this hierarchy, and oftentimes necessary in some instances, but you want to find a way to empower the different groups, and that's sort of an important theme as well within this entire structure. So if we were to compare in what I see as the differences between the two, the sociocracy kind of structure is much more collaborative, it's much more empowering, and it's much more informed in that you have people all working together, and they are staying informed throughout the entire process. And the hope is that this ends up creating a sense of flow as things change and adapt, and as you sort of build the products that you're building. Because ultimately what I'm while I might be talking fairly high level, this is all ultimately down to how do we build better products, or how do we ensure that we're building them more efficiently. Whereas the hierarchy is much more of a rigid structure, right? It's I don't have authority. I've got to go to my boss. My boss has to tell me what to do. And so it's much more inefficient, because if I want to create change within the organization, I have to go through a series of steps and gain approvals, and consensus. You know, the consensus is much more difficult to achieve, and it's not necessarily consensus. It's much more of an approval process. And this also, from a communication layer, creates a disconnect, because as I'll talk more about, things that are happening within these lower teams is being relayed back up the hierarchy chain through individual status reports. That's an example of how information is being transferred up the organizational chart. And as we'll learn in this talk, that's a very difficult and somewhat of a broken process. So this actually brings me to the Agile, and sort of how Agile is used today, and we'll ultimately tie these all together. So as some of you may or may not know, if you ever watch a webinar that I give, if the word Agile is in it, I'm going to probably bring up the Agile Manifesto. And the reason for this is because it's so amazingly written. I absolutely love the Agile Manifesto. It's so simple, so clean, and it really just says it sets an important tone. Regardless of what you think about the methodologies that have come out of the manifesto itself is really amazing. And I can go into lengthy detail about aspects of the manifesto, but for today, I'm focused really on these key words: individuals, interactions, collaboration, and responding. For me, these are action words associated with people. And that's important, because when we think about what makes a product delivery successful, it's about the people involved and how the people work together and communicate with each other to accomplish an end goal. And so that is really what the Agile Manifesto is saying, is utilize your people to get to that end result. They will make the right decisions. If they are empowered and driven and motivated, you will have success. And so how you do that is critical. And I think just to highlight this, when we look at the Agile Manifesto, the concepts that came out of this versus the terms that we hear a lot when we think about the different Agile methodologies, there's quite a few differences. You know, for me, the manifesto says interactions, collaborative, adaptive. It's about people, and it's about these feedback loops, right? When they talk about working software, the reason for this idea of working software is that we are getting these feedback loops so that we're constantly learning and improving as we go through this. But what we've ended up with these methodologies is the idea of sprints, stand-ups, backlogs, velocity, Kanban, and there's a ton of other terms here. But the question is, how is a sprint really related to collaboration? How is it related to these feedback loops? Yeah, they're small 2-week iterations, so there is an association there, but I think it's important for us to always remember that there's this underlying concept that we're attempting to accomplish when we're adapting to an Agile methodology, and that the methodology itself is not a means towards achieving collaboration and achieving success. That's a subtle, but I feel like an important point. And sort of looking at some other examples, and really what I'm doing here is I'm just kind of exploring some of the different concepts that we see when we read about Agile methodologies and what they're describing. And this is a classic diagram that I see a lot, where they're saying you first define the roadmap, then within that you define this release, and then you iterate on the different releases, and then you do these daily stand-ups. The roadmaps being high level, and all of this is iterative. This isn't meant to be any kind of stage gate process or waterfall process, but I would argue actually that waterfall's become a bad word but you could easily achieve a waterfall approach in an agile manner, because if really you take that manifesto and say to yourself, well, are we collaborative? Are we communicating? Are we working with individuals? And on some levels, you're applying different agile concepts to a waterfall approach, and that will actually help with the process. And some organizations have no choice. You think about hardware or companies that are building spaceships. That's not something that you can provide working software iteratively, right? There's a lot of upfront work that needs to take place, and so there's much more of a stage gate process, but you definitely want to encourage more collaboration. And so when I see this diagram, I sort of think to myself, well, where is the communication and the collaboration in here? And realistically, that it's assumed, it's maybe embedded in here. Yeah, the daily stand-ups are there, so we're definitely talking to the stakeholders involved in some way, but it's not clear how the collaboration, the communication is happening. And what's really not clear is that who is involved. Is this the entire organization, or is this focused primarily on the engineering team? Most people think of this as the product team and not including sales, marketing, or other folks that would otherwise care. Lean development or lean manufacturing is really interesting to me because, again, it's another sort of thought of how we can be more agile. But I think the terms that lean development calls out is really telling and really resonated with me because it aligns well with this concept of sociocracy. When you see things like amplify learning, the word amplify is such a beautiful word for me because it's a way of saying, okay, the engineering team's working on a sprint. How do we amplify what we're working on to the rest of the organization so that everybody's in alignment? How do we take that and make it so that everybody can see or everybody can hear what's happening so that it's not this delayed approach where we don't see it until the end of the sprint or the end of a release? This latter one, the empower the team, is how do we really empower the team? Because I guarantee an empowered team is a better, more successful, more efficient team. You want to empower them. We don't want to dictate what they do and when. Deadlines are great. Some people think they're a motivational factor, but oftentimes they can also be a discouraging element. Is you really want the team to sort of, if they're okay with the deadline, they've said, yeah, we can do it by this time, and they're motivated because they've come up with that, that's a powerful thing. And then building integrity, obviously that's important. Seeing the whole, again, this sort of drives that organizational view. And then I love these last two, which is eliminate waste, right? And this, again, is what I'm promoting here. When you start thinking about sociocracy and you start thinking about communication, what you'll find is that how you communicate with an organization is going to reveal areas where there's what I like to call a blockage or a stall, where it's just not efficient, right? We're losing information, we're losing time, we're losing efficiency because we're not easily communicating that information out. And the end result is that what you're really trying to do is you're trying to increase the flow, right? And again, the flow is that moment when you're just in the groove, you're working efficiently, and we all really strive for that. We love that feeling. It's at that moment when we love working at our job, right? When you just feel like everybody's in sync and we're all working together and it's going great. And so it's a great feeling. So let's talk about the Scrum Circle a bit. This is an example where the Scrum Circle itself is really almost a circle. It's a group of people that are tasked with an objective, right? And they come together. They collaborate with each other. They're incredibly efficient. You want the Scrum Circle to be empowered. And there's some important roles within the circle that's worth calling out. Now you'll notice I have this P on most of them and then a C on the other. And what that is that's this concept of a pig versus a chicken. I don't know if any of you have heard the joke, but I'm going to tell it to you now. Essentially, the joke is, and this is something that people use to describe Scrum circles, is so there's a chicken and a pig, and they're walking down the road, and the chicken says, "Hey, pig, I was thinking we should open a restaurant." Pig replies, maybe. What would we call it? The chicken responds, "How about ham and eggs?" The pig thinks for a moment and then says, "No thanks. I'd be committed, but you'd only be involved." And the reason this is relevant is because you want people to be committed to the goal, the objective, and that's what a Scrum Circle is intended to be. And these two blue figures that I have outside are the stakeholders and the managers, which are chickens. They're involved, but you want them to be involved at that perfect level, right? And that's the balance, is you want them to be participants in the process to where they're not just swooping in at the last minute. You want them to be engaged enough that they really are, in fact, involved in the process and not just simply swooping in. So there's some subtlety there, but it sort of aligns well with sociocracy. So this brings me to the third and final area, which is this idea of collaboration, right? And this is a term that I think has been out there for a long time. There's probably a lot of talks about collaboration. There's probably even some debates about collaboration. So I hope to define it more. But let's do a poll. I'm very interested in knowing, and I believe that Adrian's going to set something up so that you guys can do the poll. There it is. So I'm really interested in knowing how important you think collaboration is in your project. And whatever you think collaboration is, use your definition. And this will be interesting. So we're watching sort of the results come in, and as expected, I'm actually very happy to see this, by the way. So far, I'm seeing 96% say yes, very. 4% say sure, why not, and 0% have said not so much. And that's really, really telling, because it just goes to show that the concept of collaboration has become so much more important. And I'll be honest, it's not something that was talked about even a couple years ago. And I think the reason that's changed so much is that we've realized how important it is, and we've been given the capabilities to accomplish collaboration in a better way. And I'll talk more about that. So thank you, everybody, for doing that poll. It's very good feedback. So how do you do collaboration today? Well, my guess is that your sense of collaboration is this idea that, hey, I walked over to Joe's desk and I asked him a question and he responded, and therefore we have collaborated. And if that's the case, you're right. That is collaboration. As I'll note, there's some risk to that because that conversation happened, but no one knows about except for you and Joe. A meeting is collaboration. Getting together, a stand-up, we'll talk about that. Not sure that's collaboration, but it's definitely a catalyst to collaboration. Email, this is, I don't know, it's still out there, right? We do emails, and we love our email, and it's really hard to break free from this concept. But and yes, it's a sense of collaboration. I've sent an email and I get a response back, or I've replied all, and we're having a conversation, and there's a whole thread going on. But again, there's challenges with this because it's very difficult to take that conversation that happened in email and actually ensure that the end result of that is known and communicated to the rest of the team. There's IM. This is another form of more instant gratification. I'd say it's very akin to the walking up to somebody's desk and asking them a question. It's that short one-off conversation where the answer is at that moment, but it's not necessarily captured in anywhere. And the last is tools. And we'll talk more about this later as well, but there's a lot of tools coming out in the marketplace today. One would argue that Yammer, Facebook, these are all tools, but they're much more tools for the social sphere, the public sphere, and not really designed around business. And so I think this has been a frustration for a lot of folks, is that collaboration, as we've seen, has become increasingly important, but the technology hasn't quite kept up with that process. And again, so that's something to sort of think about in the back of your mind. I always like, when I think about collaboration, I like to think about human nature, because when we really talk about collaborating, we need to be aware of the fact that we are humans, and we can't sort of break this down into a scientific method. There's going to be lots of nuances, lots of complexities. We as humans tend to interpret things differently. I might have a conversation with someone and I may have understood it differently. There's the distinction between voice versus words. I know that oftentimes it's better to talk in person than it is to write it down, but sometimes I feel better writing it down because I can really think about what I'm saying and I don't get caught up in the conversation. So there's a time and a place where sometimes you want to have a conversation, sometimes you want to write it down, and it's really hard to sort of figure that out. I love learning other languages because I feel like words we've been sort of locked into these definitions, and when you learn another language, you sort of learn that there's other definitions, and it sort of expands your view of the world at some point. Personalities, expression, and the last one, memory, is probably the biggest factor for issues that occur, because we may have had a conversation, and I guarantee you should try this experiment. Have a meeting, and at the end of the meeting, go back to everybody half an hour later and ask what everybody's understanding or outcome of that meeting was, and chances are you'll get a bunch of different answers. So this is simply reality. There's a great story. This is actually a study that they've done out there, an experiment that you can do. I didn't know it was called telephone, or I think the other term for it is Chinese whispers, but I experienced this in high school. I had a teacher who took one of the students out of the classroom and told them a story, and then that student then told that story to the next student, and we sort of went down the chain until we got to the final student, who was responsible for getting up in front of the class and retelling the story. Well, what's the story that student told was so absolutely completely different. There was nothing remaining from the original story, and it just was amazing to see how so much information was lost in that process. And they had, I mean, literally no time passed between one person telling the story to another person, and yet we completely came to a different conclusion. And it was interesting because we could actually go back and find where somebody hadn't heard the whole story or misinterpreted part of the story, and it really was interesting to kind of see how that breakdown takes place. And so that's, again, something to keep in the back of your mind as you're thinking about collaboration and communication within your environment. So that's the concept of individuals. There's also this idea of group thinking, right? And I've been reading quite a few books on group thinking, collective genius, and there's a lot of research that's out there. There's this book called Quiet, the concept of introverts versus extroverts. And the idea here is that we've been putting so much emphasis on having these brainstorming sessions. Like, we're going to get everybody in the room and we're going to utilize the brain power of the group, and we're going to come to these amazing revelations. And the reality is that you get into those situations and the extroverts dominate the conversation, and the introverts are sort of not able to speak up, or they don't speak up. So how do you balance your environment so that you're allowing everybody within the organization to have a voice when they have these different personalities? So this is something to sort of be aware of, is that meetings aren't the end-all be-all, but there's other avenues that's worth pursuing. They've also done studies to show that, in fact, the whole brainstorming sessions don't work. That oftentimes if you take if you did two groups or the same group and had them go off and think on their own, it's amazing that they actually are almost more creative when outside of the room. So there's a combination there that's important. But the other sort of subtleties to collaboration or group thinking is this idea of diversity. The more diverse the group is, and so let's take a circle as an example. If you look at your circle and think, who's in that group? Do we have a diverse type of group of folks? And this is like people with different domain knowledge or different technology understandings, or there's lots of ways in which we can think of diversity so that we're bringing different ideas. And this is where, again, the double linking, I think, is important, because you want sales or marketing or the executives or stakeholders to be in that conversation so that you're adding that different perspective. And then just some subtle things here, again, voice versus words, providing some kind of starting point. You don't want to just simply bring people in the room and say, all right, we're going to solve world peace. You want to have something as a starting point. And association is kind of an interesting concept of, we're working on something or on a concept, and having that sort of understanding is going to be helpful. So our stand-ups collaboration, again, we're sort of highlighting lots of different areas and trying to sort of narrow in on what collaboration really is. And I don't know if I'm going to answer this today, but I hope I shed some light on it. But stand-ups are interesting because I think a lot of people think that by doing stand-ups we're being collaborative, and I argue that that's not the case. It's really designed to highlight or get to the bottom of certain things very quickly. Everybody goes around the room and says, what are they working on, and are they blocked? Right? That's the limit of a stand-up. Now, one thing that could come out of a stand-up is this idea of a catalyst for collaboration. If somebody says, hey, I'm blocked on such and such, or I don't understand what I'm working on, or I'm confused, or I have a question, then it enables somebody to say, well, let's have a conversation after the fact, and collaboration ensues. So it's a great opportunity to ensure that people are coming together frequently to sort of ensure that things are getting addressed. So it's a great catalyst for collaboration. It's also fairly circle focused, right? It's a perfect example of a circle, and that's why I bring this up, because you already have circles in place within your organization. And so this is important because you have collaboration that's probably happening within your organization, and you can probably point at different groups. It might be your engineering team, your agile team, it might be the marketing team, it might be the sales team, and you might say to yourself, they're really collaborative. They're incredibly successful as a group. But what you may find is that those groups aren't connecting, or there isn't a way for the information that's occurring in this downstream group to find its way up the organization ladder. And so we end up with a couple problems that we've heard in many, many articles, is that Agile's really struggled to expand outside of the engineering team. And this is what we're constantly faced with. I know the business analysts, product managers, I hear it from sales, I hear it from marketing, I hear it from so many of our customers that they're attempting to utilize Agile, but they feel disconnected from the Agile team itself, the engineering team, and that should not be the case. So the last piece is that collaboration, everything I've been talking about, is that it hasn't evolved. You know, the concept itself hasn't really matured or evolved. We haven't thought about, well, how really are we going to collaborate efficiently? It should be, I'll tell you an example. We get a lot of RFIs or RFPs from customers, and collaboration is a small piece of that, if at all. And it should be like the number one thing is how does your solution solve collaboration? How does it ensure that everybody's talking to each other, that the conversations are being tracked? So again, if we just look at this another way, and this is again just highlighting the fact that you probably have circles within your organization. You have a product team, you have sales, you have customers, you have marketing, services, executives. There are probably circles already existing within your organization. So I'm not saying change everything, or that there's this huge overhead that's incurred in utilizing Sociocracy, but that you have all the tools necessary to accomplish this. So now that we've gone through all three of those things, I'm going to attempt to tie it all together. And you'll have to let me know whether I succeed at this. So, Sociocracy and collaboration. Here's an example of a bigger picture. And again, the circles themselves, there's no definition or no rule really on how many people need to exist in a circle. You may look at this and say, well, it looks like you've got 5 and 6 and 4 and 3 in these different circles. I would argue that 20 is probably a lot, but is manageable. There's some interesting companies out there, which I'll talk a bit about, like Gore Technologies is one. When a facility exceeds 100 people, they split it up, or they start a new facility, because they believe that 100 people is the maximum number of people that can exist in a single facility. So that's one big circle where they've decided that collaboration begins to break down past 100 folks. So I think in these teams, you want to design or define what that limit is. I would say that 5 to 20 is a fine sized circle. So you can see that you have these overlaps, and so the product team is working on something, and there are 2 members that are double linked. Now, one of these members might be somebody on the product team, and another member might be somebody on the marketing team, but the fact is that they both interact with both teams equally. That is, the engineering spends its time with the engineering team in their meetings, but also attends the marketing meetings. And so this ensures that two people are responsible for translating or interpreting the communication that's going from one department to the other department. And this sort of, again, is avoiding that hierarchical transfer of information. Now, what you may find, and we'll talk more about this, is that, again, you may look at this and go, wow, that seems really complex. But trust me, you are already kind of doing this. You're just not doing it efficiently. So JAMA is actually a good example. We have similar departments as any other organization has. We've got a product team, we've got marketing, we have executives, we have my team, the solutions architects, and then we have sales. And there's some natural overlaps. The product team and the marketing team interact with each other a lot. The solutions architects interact with marketing quite a bit, and we interact with sales a lot. So all of a sudden you realize that it's not necessary for the product team to have a meeting with the entire organization to try and ensure that everybody's on the same page, but that by creating these overlaps, you sort of ensure that communication is flowing freely between the different groups and that everybody's in alignment with what's taking place. So this is just an example of sociocracy in action. So the big question you might be asking is, great, how do I get started on implementing this? I think the first step is to do some analysis by evaluating who's attending meetings and maybe how many people are in those meetings. You'll realize that there's already these circles forming. What you'll find as well probably is that there's no consistency in who's invited to those meetings, and that there is no double linking. That the double linking is really where it's breaking down. That different people are being pulled in, they're not consistent, and so that becomes a problem. You also want to sort of understand, how are conversations and decisions being shared today? Are they happening inside of a meeting and then posted on a wiki? Are they not posted anywhere? Do they just simply happen in the meeting and it's assumed that the decision that comes out of there is going to be relayed? Is some one person given the job to make sure that everybody else is aware of the decision that was made? That's sort of important, and this sort of gets into your policies that you want to understand. That's the last thing, is what policies are in place? Like how are the teams empowered to operate? So then to get started, you want to define the circles, and really what I'm saying here is that you may find, all right, we have the Scrum team, but let's call it a circle. Let's say that this is a circle, and let's then figure out where the other circle is, because you may find all the different circles and you won't realize that there's any overlap. Have those circles create policies. Have them sit together in a room and say, okay, what are our policies on how we operate and how we accomplish? How do we want to share information? How do we want to work? And make sure that that's happening by consensus, because by doing that, you've empowered that team. And that goes to this next one. You want to give circles control, right? And this is probably the hardest thing for organizations that have a really strong hierarchy, is that it's going to feel like you're letting go of control. But what you're really doing is you're empowering those teams to ultimately make decisions. And the managers or the VPs should be aware of this and definitely should be involved in that process, but there shouldn't be a sense or a fear that those decisions are going to be overridden. If the team feels like they're going to be successful with these decisions, let them be successful. Let them try it. And I think that's an important sort of note to those individuals. The other thing is to sort of de-emphasize the titles, right? This isn't about managers or leads or anything to that effect. The team ultimately should come to that conclusion. If the team sort of sits in a room and decides, well, what happens if we can't come to a conclusion? What happens if we're unable to come to a consensus on an idea? Well, the team may elect somebody as the go-to person for the final decision, right? And that person could be anybody. And ultimately what's going to happen is that the person chosen is going to be someone is going to be trusted, because again, it should be done through consensus on who that person is if that scenario comes up. A great story there is Gore Technologies. So Gore Technologies is the organization I've been referring to where they don't have titles. Everybody who joins Gore Technologies is an associate. And in fact, when the CEO, the founder of Gore Technologies, stepped down, it was decided that they needed a new CEO. And how they did that was by the organization, through consensus, determined who the next CEO was. And it was, somebody that wasn't applying for the job, or it wasn't somebody from outside, it was somebody from internal. And that's sort of an amazing story to sort of realize that that can work. And Gore Technologies now has 9,000 people, and they're still operating under this idea of empowering teams to make decisions. Google's another good example. The last is to measure and reward. And so this again just gives, this is going to give management confidence, is that the team should measure themselves. They should say, okay, we've come up with these policies, we've determined what we want to accomplish, but more importantly, rather than just simply saying, what are we delivering, it's how are we going to measure the success of what we're delivering? How at the end of the day are we going to be able to say we were successful? Is it that the features that we promised were delivered on time and under budget? Maybe. But that's important to sort of come to consensus on, is what are we as a team going to measure ourselves on? And are there any rewards associated with that? We live by rewards. So from there, you want to expand upwards, right? You want to be able to, again, you may find that the engineering team already is agile, and so therefore you have a circle. That's a great place to start, because now you've got this circle, and you just need to sort of figure out who the roles, who the people are, and then find those double links and maybe include other folks. You may want to say, well, we're kind of missing marketing here. How do we get them in? Or we're missing the customer, or we're missing an executive. How do we get them in, and how do we make them more involved so they're not sort of coming in last minute or randomly? You really want them to feel part of the circle. They're part of the decision policy making. They're part of the collaboration and communication that's taking place. They might not be the ones building the software, but they're involved to the extent that they're really truly involved. From there, expand out. So once you've identified those sort of double linking folks, then they should then figure out who their team is and operate out of that structure. The last two is smart meetings, and I should probably put some more definition with this because I'm being fairly vague. What I'm really saying is, when you have meetings, make them worthwhile. Give them a purpose. Make sure that there's goals, and I know that we've heard there's a ton of articles out there about how to conduct proper meetings, but I'll give you an example here at JAMA. When we're sort of we're marching towards a release, our engineering team does these weekly sort of review sessions. It's essentially the Agile provide working software, and they're providing a review of what took place. I consider those incredibly smart meetings, because they've determined who the consistent folks from the different departments should be involved. It's not a company-wide meeting, but they've pulled in the right folks, and they've done these really smart, sort of intelligent, here's where we're at, here's where we're going, here's what's next, and those are incredibly efficient. The last is using tools for efficiency, and this is, again, something I'll highlight in a moment. I think that to truly be efficient and collaborative, you're ultimately going to need tools. So what are the benefits? My belief is that if you employ these things, the benefits that you're going to see is innovation. You're going to see more quality, because you're giving people the flow. They're more empowered, and there's just more integrity built into the overall concept. Things are going to be more accurate. Accuracy is going to be part of it. People will be alignment. And lastly, my belief is that you'll experience more joy and happiness, because as I've been bringing up, this idea of flow, when you're in that groove and things are just rocking along, people are happy, and that's a great place to be, because that's when people are more creative, they're more free to be more innovative, and everything sort of aligns well with that. They work harder, more efficiently, and so you want to accomplish this sort of sense of excitement, motivation, which is all driven by, in my opinion, joy and happiness. So, kind of coming to a close here. A couple interesting companies. I highly recommend you just do some research on these companies. Of course, I put ourselves there because I love JAMA, but really Spotify, Gore, Google, they're very interesting in how they're creating structure, innovation, how they create these different circles. They allow people to move from one circle to the other if they're not happy, but the team sort of help manage that. So there's a lot of empowerment going on within these organizations, and they're incredibly successful as a result. So really worth looking into. You'll learn a lot from them. Lastly, of course, it would be irresponsible for me not to bring up tools, because that's what we provide. And again, when you look at the different technologies or capabilities with collaboration, there are all these independent ways in which we collaborate. But what you want to think about when you think about tools is, does the tool do everything? Does it, and I'm not saying everything, but does it pull it all together, right? Does it enable conversations to happen inside of a repository? Does it enable me to access those conversations remotely? Does it enable these emails to, can we use email to accomplish this thing? These are all things that we believe JAMA has pulled together through conversations, requirements, agile development, ideas. These are the things that we pulled together. And one of the things that I highly encourage you to download a trial, look at the trial, check out what we call the Review Center. It's really a collaborative platform where you can share information. And a great example of this is that you can do these reviews. The introverts of the organization have an opportunity to look at the information, think about it, be creative, write down their thoughts. People can respond to that, and then based on this information, you can head into a meeting and have a much more effective meeting in association with that information. So when you're thinking about your products and you're thinking, and this is getting more specific about requirements, use cases, defects, test cases, and you really want to engage in this collaborative effort, you can utilize our software to accomplish that. So we'll make this slide and this video available. Here's a bunch of references that I've provided for you all to check out. And as well, this webinar is available for PDU credits. And so again, we'll send this PowerPoint to you, or PDF format, and you'll have this information. And if you are interested, go to jamasoftware.com. You can start a trial directly from there. And again, I'm very interested in any feedback you have about this webinar. But thank you very much, and let's go ahead and open it up for questions.
Thanks a lot, Darwin. We've had quite a few questions come in. I have about 5 to 10 minutes left here, so I'll try to ask you as many as I can, but like Darwin said earlier, we'll definitely follow up with everyone if we can't get to your question now. But first one here, you talk about consensus a lot, Darwin. Obviously, consensus can take a long time. Are you really talking about true consensus or majority rules?
Yeah, I am. In a perfect world, I'm talking about true consensus. I think that consensus is ultimately, on some level, it's about majority rules, because there's going to be a compromise. If there literally is one person who absolutely disagrees with the concepts that the rest of the team is coming up with, then it's the responsibility of that team to sort of try and find that compromise. Why is that person or that group of folks so adamant about not wanting to head down that path? So I hesitate to say that majority rules is the right way, because you don't want that. You don't want to have a team where you're utilizing or you're operating under a concept that several members of the team just simply didn't agree with. That's a tough place to be, right? And so it's not an easy question to answer, because in a perfect world, you really do want that consensus to occur, and sometimes that does take time to accomplish. And keep in mind, when I describe consensus, it's about defining the policies. This isn't necessarily about getting work done or the ongoing day-to-day. It's about defining the policies that you operate under. And so one of those policies might be majority rules, right? If the group all agrees that in order to move things along, we need to ensure that if a decision can't be made by consensus, that someone or majority is the sort of deciding factor. That's definitely, it's fair, right? That's something that you want to include. So I think it's important to note that when I talk about consensus, it's around, in the terms of sociocracy, it's around the definition of the policies that you operate under.
Great, thanks. Kind of on a similar note, can you speak to the differences between consensus, collaboration, and convergence?
The difference between consensus, collaboration, and convergence. Maybe I can talk the difference. I'll do my best attempt. Definitely between consensus and collaboration. I mean, collaboration is the manner in which you come to consensus, right? So it's really about working together to come to a conclusion. That conclusion is ultimately consensus. So those, I see those as very different. In terms of convergence, it's a good question. I don't know if I could really call out the difference. I mean, if I was to take a guess, I see it as that we're working towards something, but that might, yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer for that. But I do see that they're all quite different. I don't necessarily see them as being the same, but related. You know, they work together.
Thanks. In the group thinking, back to the extroverts, and the extroverts dominate the meetings. Do you think the group thinking keeps on following along? And then also, could you mention the book that you were referring to about introverts and extroverts?
Yeah. So the book is called "Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking" by Susan Cain. So that's on the reference here. The Group Genius book is by Keith Sawyer. Two really great books. It just dives into the research around collaboration and communication and group thinking. Is this whole concept of brainstorming in meetings really that effective? Does it really create more innovation and more creativity? They found that it's actually not the case. But that's not to say that there's not a time and a place for it. There's just guidelines associated with it. So there's just a lot of research that's happening now about how we interact. And so the book by Susan Cain about the introverts, again, just highlights that it's sort of they're related in the sense that they're both talking and starting from the idea of these brainstorming sessions where right now today, I mean, I'm an extrovert, right? I'm very loud. You get me into a meeting, and I have to be careful not to dominate the meeting. I have to be aware of myself, and I have to check myself and give other folks an opportunity. But the tendency in those brainstorming sessions is it's very difficult for us to listen to somebody while thinking about a new idea at the same time. So if you think about it just from that perspective alone, it's a very inefficient process because we're asked to brainstorm new ideas, but then as people are yelling out new ideas, we're distracted. So we're not given that opportunity to just sit down. And I'll be honest, I have some of my most innovative creative moments when I am working on just drawing something on a piece of paper, or when I'm in the shower, or when I'm playing piano, or right, there's just these moments of enlightenment that we have. And part of what the Group Genius talks about is, when do those moments of enlightenment take place? How do we sort of foster those moments? And I've had them happen in meetings. I've had them happen when I'm alone. So you want to find this balance.
Thanks. It would appear that that culture would have much more of an impact than processes or tools and/or tools. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, culture is critical, right? That's absolutely true. But what is culture? Culture is the environment that's being fostered, and culture will change. Even when I was in a small team, this was many years ago. I was in a development team, and we had, I think there were 6 of us, and we had gotten into a groove. We were in what I would call harmonious flow, right? We were working well together. We were brainstorming well together. We really all just got along. And then we did the big hiring spring. I think we hired 8 new folks, and the entire thing was disrupted. The culture was broken. It was very difficult, and I don't know if we ever recovered. And so the people involved matter, the process in place matters, the way in which you collaborate. But again, it comes down to these empowering people to kind of figure that out is really important, and creating these opportunities for people to resolve their differences or come to that consensus. And that's why these different groups, sometimes smaller is better, and then you enable them to, you might find that one group is working differently than another group, but as long as there's an overlap, the double linking again, you're ensuring that they're not simply doing something opposite or different than the other group or out of spite, right? You want some cohesiveness to be going on there. But culture's critical, and the hope is that these ideas, I mean, if you look at Gore Technologies and Google, they've got a great culture, but did the culture happen naturally, or is the culture a result of the powers that be? On many levels, the result is the powers that be. I know that we have folks here who come from Jive, and Jive was a very just open, anything goes, let's hash it out. And then I was reading about Google, where Google's a much more polite, nobody speaks out or above anybody, but it's still very collaborative and there's lots of consensus. So culture is very much about kind of the policies and just the tones that's sort of by the leadership.
Thanks a lot, Derwin. I think that's about all the time we have for questions. Sorry if I wasn't able to get your question. Like I said, we will be following up with a link to the recording on Modern Analyst site. And feel free to reach out to Derwin at any time. So thanks a lot.
I definitely encourage that. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you, Derwin, for an informative presentation. Thank you to everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I wanted to point out that the webinar, along with the